When Emma first arrived in New York City, she never imagined that her life would be haunted by a secret so dark it would change everything. She had grown up in a quiet, rural town, a place where the closest thing to a mystery was the occasional missing pet. Moving to the city for college was a big step. She found a small, affordable apartment and shared it with a roommate named Carla, who she had met through an online housing platform. At first glance, Carla seemed perfect. She was quiet, respectful, and had a warm, welcoming smile. They exchanged pleasantries when Emma moved in, and everything seemed normal. Carla worked long hours, often leaving Emma alone in the apartment for the majority of the day. Emma was okay with that. After all, she was there to study, and the solitude helped her focus. But it didn't take long for Emma to sense something strange about her new living situation. For one, Carla never let Emma into her room. It wasn't locked, but every time Emma tried to walk past it, Carla would be standing in the doorway, casually blocking her way, as if guarding the threshold. When Emma questioned her about it, Carla would brush it off with a tight smile, saying, "I just like my space, you know? I'm not a fan of people snooping around." Emma thought nothing of it. After all, everyone had their quirks. It wasn't just the room that bothered Emma. The apartment itself had an eerie quality. The walls were adorned with vintage art, mostly landscapes and portraits. But what really stood out were the mirrors, or more accurately, the lack of them. There were no mirrors in the apartment, save for a small one in the bathroom. At first, Emma thought it was just a personal preference of Carla's, but the more she looked around, the more she realized how odd it was. No mirrors in the hallway, no mirrors in the living room, and none in the bedrooms except for that one in the bathroom. "Why are all the mirrors covered or missing?" Emma asked one evening as they were having dinner. Carla's expression shifted slightly, her eyes darkening. "I don't like mirrors," she said curtly, turning her attention back to her plate. "They make me uneasy." Emma didn't press the matter further. She had been raised in a small town, where people's habits were often peculiar, and she assumed this was just one of Carla's personal preferences. But the unease in her own stomach grew. She found herself avoiding the bathroom mirror as much as possible, unnerved by the thought that something might be lurking behind her reflection. Weeks passed, and life seemed to settle into a monotonous routine. Emma kept to herself, immersing herself in her studies. But one evening, around 3 a.m., she was woken by the sound of faint knocking. It was soft at first, but persistent. At first, she thought it was the sound of the wind, but the knocking continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Emma sat up in bed, her heart racing. She glanced at her phone. It was definitely 3 a.m. The knocking seemed to come from the hallway, but when she listened closely, she realized it was coming from Carla's room. She waited, confused, trying to piece together what was happening. The knocking continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly, as though someone had simply ceased to exist. Emma, her pulse still racing, slipped out of bed and cautiously walked down the hallway. She stood outside Carla's door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. But before she could knock, Carla's voice floated from behind the door. "Go back to bed, Emma," Carla said softly. There was a strange, almost comforting quality to her voice, but it didn't make Emma feel any less uneasy. Emma retreated back to her room, unsettled by the oddness of the situation. But when she asked Carla about the knocking the next morning, Carla dismissed it as a sleepwalking episode she sometimes experienced. Emma wasn't convinced. She didn't press the issue. Carla seemed so sure of herself, so calm, that Emma simply brushed it off. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, Emma began to notice more anomalies in the apartment. The most unsettling of these was the locked drawer in the kitchen. It was always shut, always locked, and whenever Emma passed by, Carla seemed to keep a watchful eye on it. Emma had never been one to pry, but one day, as she reached for a mug, her hand accidentally brushed against the drawer. It was enough to make Carla snap. "Don't touch that," Carla said sharply, her face a strange mix of panic and anger. Emma withdrew her hand quickly, startled by Carla's reaction. The drawer seemed so insignificant. What could possibly be inside that warranted such a fierce reaction? That night, as Emma lay in bed, she heard the faintest sound coming from the kitchen. A soft rustling, as though someone was sifting through papers. Emma's curiosity got the better of her, and she quietly slipped out of bed and padded toward the kitchen. The apartment was bathed in darkness, the only light coming from the moon outside. She stood at the kitchen doorway, heart pounding in her chest. And there, in the dim light, she saw it. Carla, kneeling by the drawer, rifling through the contents. Carla didn't see her at first, but when she did, she looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "What are you doing?" Emma asked, voice trembling. Carla stood up slowly, a faint smile on her lips. "Nothing," she said, just organizing some things." She shut the drawer quickly, locking it once more. Emma didn't believe her. She was certain there was something in that drawer that Carla didn't want her to see. But what? The next night, Emma decided to investigate. Carla had gone to bed early, leaving Emma alone in the apartment. She waited until she was sure Carla was asleep, then slipped out of bed and tiptoed into the kitchen. She approached the drawer, her hand trembling as she reached for the lock. It clicked open easily, and Emma pulled it out. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them. Some were old, others new, but they all featured Carla. The first few pictures were normal, just snapshots of a young woman with a wide, smiling face. But as Emma flipped through the photos, her heart began to pound. The further she went, the more disturbing the images became. In each photo, there was a shadowy figure standing just behind Carla. It wasn't quite human, its shape distorted, its face hidden in darkness. The figure seemed to loom closer with each picture, as if stalking Carla, following her. Emma dropped the photos, her hands shaking. She couldn't believe what she had found. Why had Carla kept these photographs? Who was that figure? And why had it been following her? The answer came that night. Around 2 a.m., Emma woke to the sound of knocking again. This time, it was louder, frantic, almost desperate. She shot up in bed, her pulse racing. The knocking came from Carla's room, but something was different. There was an edge to it now, a sense of urgency that sent a chill down Emma's spine. She stood in the hallway, frozen, listening. The knocking stopped, but then she heard a voice, a low, gravelly whisper coming from the other side of Carla's door. "Help me," the voice murmured. Emma's heart skipped a beat. It sounded like Carla, but there was something wrong with it. Like the voice was being manipulated, distorted. Before she could react, the door to Carla's room creaked open. Emma stumbled backward, and there, standing in the doorway, was Carla, her eyes wide, her face pale and stricken with fear. She reached out to Emma, her fingers trembling. "Don't look at it," Carla whispered urgently. "It's been following me. It won't stop." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. Carla was not who she seemed to be. The figure in the photographs was real, and it was with Carla. The last thing Emma remembered before she ran out of the apartment was the soft, eerie knocking that continued long after she fled. She never returned to that apartment. And to this day, whenever she sees a shadow in the corner of her eye, she wonders, is it following her too? David had always been an early riser. He was a man of routine, working long hours as a corporate consultant, often traveling between cities. His days were filled with meetings, deadlines, and paperwork. To make the most of his time, he had developed the habit of taking the early morning trains. The trains were nearly empty at this time of day, and David found solace in the quiet, uninterrupted ride. One particularly cold morning in November, David boarded the 5:15 a.m. train from Manhattan to Newark, a trip he had made countless times. The platform was deserted, save for a few tired commuters. He stepped onto the train, his breath visible in the crisp air, and settled into his usual seat by the window. The train's interior was dimly lit, with only a few scattered passengers, most of them asleep. David, as always, put on his headphones and began to read through some work emails. The train started its journey, rumbling steadily through the city's outskirts. As it passed through dark, industrial zones, the distant lights of the city flickered in the background. David was lost in his work, occasionally glancing up to check the time. He was used to the subtle sway of the train, the rhythmic hum of its wheels on the tracks. But something felt different this time. At first, it was barely noticeable, a fleeting sensation, like the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He looked up, scanning the train car, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Most of the passengers were asleep or glued to their phones. He shrugged it off as exhaustion. But then he noticed something strange. The seat across from him, which had been empty when he boarded, now had a man sitting in it. He hadn't seen the man board the train, and the train had already been moving for several minutes. David glanced over, his curiosity piqued. The man appeared to be in his late 30s, with a gaunt face and unkempt brown hair. He was wearing a long, dark coat, and his eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead. The man's gaze was unsettling, too still, too vacant, as though he was staring at something David couldn't see. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and David couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. David tried to ignore him, returning to his phone, but the discomfort lingered. The train passed through the darkness of the tunnel, and for a brief moment the lights flickered. When they came back on, the man was no longer sitting across from him. David's heart skipped a beat. He checked the train car again. There was no sign of the man. He frowned, unsure of what to make of it. Had he imagined the whole thing? The man's appearance had felt so real, so vivid, but now there was no trace of him, no sign of movement. The seat was still empty. The train rumbled on, and David tried to push the incident to the back of his mind. Maybe it was just a figment of his imagination, or perhaps he had dozed off for a second and missed the man getting up. He couldn't explain it, but he had no time to dwell on it either. He had an important meeting waiting for him in Newark. As the train continued, David started to feel increasingly uneasy. The lights flickered again, this time with more intensity. The air seemed to grow heavier, colder. David looked around, but everyone else remained oblivious. He shifted in his seat, trying to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept returning to the man who had disappeared. His unease grew with every passing minute. Then, as the train approached a particularly desolate stretch of track, David heard something. It was a low, almost imperceptible sound, like someone breathing heavily, just behind him. He turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The train car was still almost empty. David's pulse quickened. Was it just his imagination again, or was someone really there? He looked over his shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of any movement. But the train car remained eerily still. He glanced back toward the seat where the man had been sitting earlier, and his blood ran cold. The man was back, but this time, he wasn't sitting across from him. He was standing, inches away from David, staring down at him with those same vacant eyes. His face was so close that David could feel the chill radiating off his skin. The man's mouth was slightly open, but no sound came from it. David could barely breathe. He shot up from his seat, his heart hammering in his chest. He stumbled backward, bumping into another passenger, who woke up with a start and shot him a confused look. But when David turned to look back at the man, he was gone, vanished as if he had never been there at all. David's mind raced. What was happening? Had he lost his grip on reality? Was he hallucinating? He couldn't explain what he had just seen, but the terror was real. Every instinct told him to get off the train as soon as possible, but they were miles from the next stop. He grabbed his phone, trying to focus on something, anything, to calm his nerves. But his hands were trembling. It felt like the air around him had grown thick, as though the train car was closing in. David glanced out the window, but the landscape was pitch black. No streetlights, no signs of civilization. Only the occasional flash of distant lights. The man's image was seared into his mind. He could almost feel the cold breath on his neck again, the eerie silence, the vacant stare. But as the train continued on its path, David convinced himself it was all in his head. He had been working too hard, too many late nights. Surely he was just tired. Then it happened again. David was jolted from his thoughts when the train suddenly came to an abrupt halt, throwing him forward into the seat in front of him. The lights flickered violently, and for a moment, everything was plunged into complete darkness. A few people gasped, but most remained seated, seemingly unfazed by the disruption. When the lights returned, David's eyes shot to the space in front of him. And there, in the seat just opposite him, was the man once again, his vacant gaze fixed on him. He was no longer standing, but seated, and this time he was grinning. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was twisted, wrong, like something out of a nightmare. David could feel the blood draining from his face. His body refused to move, his feet rooted to the floor as though frozen by some invisible force. The man leaned forward, slowly, his lips parting in a grotesque whisper. "You shouldn't be here, David." David's stomach dropped. His heart raced. How did this man know his name? His thoughts were a blur as he stumbled to his feet, desperate to get away. But the train had stopped in the middle of nowhere, with no station in sight. Suddenly, the train jolted forward again, moving at a speed much faster than before. The man didn't flinch. He remained seated, watching David intently, as if nothing was amiss. David stumbled toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, the train came to another screeching halt. The lights flickered once more, and when they came back on, the man was standing right behind him, breathing heavily into his ear. "No one is getting off," the man murmured. David spun around in a panic, but the man had vanished again. He was alone. He rushed to the nearest exit and forced open the door. The train was stationary on a stretch of barren land, no signs of life anywhere. His breath was ragged and his hands shook as he jumped off the train and ran into the night, never once looking back. To this day, David has never taken that train again. He still doesn't know what he saw that night, but he is certain of one thing. There was something on that train. Something he couldn't explain. Something that would have followed him if he hadn't escaped. Carla had always been a creature of habit. She lived alone in a modest apartment in an old building on the outskirts of a small town. The building itself had seen better days, with peeling paint on the walls, creaky floors, and a general air of neglect that seemed to creep through every hallway. Carla didn't mind, though. She was used to it. It was cheap, it was hers, and it was quiet. Her routine was simple. She worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, spending her days in front of a computer, designing logos, websites, and all manner of creative work. At night, she would make dinner, watch some TV, and read a book before heading to bed. Her life was solitary but peaceful, and she enjoyed the silence that came with living alone. But everything changed one winter evening in late December. It had been snowing heavily that day, and by the time Carla finished her work, the world outside was covered in a thick blanket of snow. The streets were quiet, the only sounds being the occasional car passing by or the faint rustling of wind outside her window. It was the kind of night that made you want to curl up under a blanket and stay indoors. And that's exactly what Carla did. She made herself a hot cup of tea, settled onto the couch, and turned on the TV. The wind howled outside, but Carla barely noticed. She had grown accustomed to the noises that came with living in an old building. The occasional creak of the floorboards, the sound of pipes rattling, and the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls had become background noise to her. But as she sat there sipping her tea and watching the flickering images on the screen, she suddenly felt watched. It was an odd sensation, one that she couldn't quite explain. She glanced around her apartment, but nothing seemed out of place. The living room was empty, the kitchen was quiet, and the hallway leading to the bathroom was as dark and still as usual. She shook her head and dismissed the feeling, attributing it to the isolation of living alone. Still, something in the back of her mind wouldn't let it go. The feeling persisted, gnawing at her as the evening wore on. As the night deepened and the snow continued to fall, Carla's unease only grew. She found herself glancing toward the window, drawn to the faint reflection of the streetlights shimmering off the snow outside. The reflection in the glass seemed to distort the shapes of the buildings across the street, making them appear slightly warped. But it wasn't the reflection that unsettled her. It was the shape she saw in the window. At first, it was nothing more than a vague outline, just a blur in the reflection. Carla tried to ignore it, but the image lingered in the corner of her vision. Her eyes flicked back to it, and her heart skipped a beat. There, in the dim reflection of the window, she could clearly see the figure of a woman standing on the other side of the glass. The figure was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakable. It was the silhouette of a woman in a long coat, her face obscured by the darkness outside. She stood perfectly still, staring directly at Carla. The longer Carla looked, the more real the figure seemed to become. It was as if the woman was actually standing right outside her apartment, staring in. Panic surged through Carla's body. She jumped up from the couch, her heart racing, and rushed to the window. She pulled back the curtains, expecting to find nothing but the empty street, just as it had been all evening. But when she looked out, the street was still empty. No woman, no figure, nothing. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the ground in a soft, white layer. Confused and unsettled, Carla closed the curtains and backed away from the window. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. After all, she had been alone in the apartment for hours, and the apartment was on the second floor. There was no way anyone could be standing right outside her window, staring in. But the feeling didn't go away. For the rest of the night, Carla couldn't shake the image of the woman in the window. Every time she glanced toward the glass, she felt that same prickle of unease, as though the woman was still standing out there, watching her. The sensation grew stronger, and she found herself growing more and more paranoid. She couldn't focus on the TV, and every noise in the building seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't think straight. And by the time dawn finally broke, Carla was exhausted, her mind racing with thoughts of the woman outside the window. The next day, she called her best friend, Sarah, and told her everything that had happened the previous night. Sarah listened patiently, but she sounded skeptical. "Carla, I think you're just stressed," Sarah said. "It's been a long winter, and you've been working non-stop. Maybe you just need a good night's sleep." But Carla couldn't let it go. She had seen the woman, she had felt her presence, and it was too real to ignore. That afternoon, she made a point of checking the outside of the building, looking for any sign that someone had been there. But when she stepped outside and walked around to the back, she found nothing. No footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone having been there. It was as though the woman had never existed. For the next few days, the strange feeling continued to haunt Carla. She could never fully relax in her apartment, always feeling as though someone was watching her, lurking just outside her window. Every time she glanced toward the glass, she half expected to see the woman again, but there was never anyone there. One evening a week later, Carla was sitting on the couch when she felt the familiar sensation return. Her skin crawled as she looked toward the window, instinctively knowing that the woman was there, even before she saw her. Slowly, she turned her head toward the reflection in the glass. This time, the woman's face was visible. Her features were pale and ghostly, her eyes wide and empty, as though she was staring into Carla's soul. Carla's breath caught in her throat. She bolted up from the couch, trembling with fear, and rushed to the window, flinging the curtains open. But as always, there was nothing outside. No woman, no figure, just the quiet, snow-covered street. Desperation set in. Carla was at her wit's end. She couldn't explain what was happening, but she was certain that something or someone was haunting her apartment. She spent the rest of the night pacing the floor, waiting for the woman to appear again. But she never did. The next morning, Carla called her landlord and demanded to know more about the building. She had to know if anyone had lived there before her, or if anything strange had happened in the apartment. The landlord's response chilled her to the bone. "Oh, I'm sure you've noticed by now," the landlord said, his voice strangely calm. "The building's been around for a long time, and over the years, there have been some odd occurrences. But it's mostly harmless. The woman you've seen, she's not really there. At least, not in the way you think." Carla's heart dropped. She tried to press for more information, but the landlord was evasive, offering no further details. That night, the woman appeared again. This time, there was no mistaking it. She was standing right outside the window, her face twisted into a grotesque expression of sorrow. And this time, Carla didn't run to the window. She didn't even try to open the curtains. She knew, in that moment, that there was no escaping it. The woman was always there, watching, waiting. Thanks for watching, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for more new videos.